John chapter number 11. The book of John chapter number 11, and we want to look at another of the I am statements, and it's this: I am the resurrection and the life. We'll introduce it this morning in John chapter 11. It's really can't look at this single statement without going through and looking at the context in which the statement is made. Most of us have experienced the reality and the sting of death in some form or another. I have stated today that, or stated before in our church, that funerals are no longer welcome here. We are canceling all funeral services. The only way you can get out of this church is through the rapture. And so that's it, all right? So we're not doing it. I don't know if you heard the news today. Today is supposed to be the end of the world. You know that? I'm serious. A guy calculated today was doomsday, and he calculated it based on a number of things. 33 is the magic number, and 33 days since it seems like one of the hurricanes. It was 33, and there was a number of things that were thrown in. Anyway, I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the article. I was more intrigued by the article that came. That was earlier on in the week, that today was the doomsday. And about 2 days ago, he revised his thinking. What a coincidence. Anyway, so it's still, today marks the beginning of doomsday, which, the rest of it still is going to take place later on. We don't have to fall into that stuff as believers, and it's really a wonderful encouragement that's here. But nonetheless, we have experienced the reality, the sting of death. It could be that it was done by means of just an acquaintance. It may be a very dear friend. It could be a parent, a spouse, a child, a sibling, a co-worker. Regardless of how it came about, those who experience the reality of death also experience the reality of the sorrow that accompanies it. And I realize that even if it is a believer who has gone home to be with the Lord, there still is a sorrow that is there, and it's okay. Jesus' example in John 11, as well as the passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 that teaches we should not sorrow as those who have no hope. It's okay to have sorrow, but yet we have to realize that ultimately that they are better off if in fact they are with the Lord. Unless the Lord returns, death is a reality that all of us are one day going to be faced with. When did death enter into the scene, and when did it enter into the world? Well, it is very clear from the Word of God that death was never something that was God's intent. Death entered the world the exact moment that sin entered into the world. When you go back and you understand in the book of Genesis early on, God gave very clear instruction to Adam that he and Eve were not to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Whatever tree you want, Adam, you guys can have that. Just this one tree you can't have. Isn't it interesting how the one thing that we view as a restriction is the one thing that we often are tempted by? Okay? We look at all sorts. You got all of this out here. You just can't have this. Well, that's what I want. And tell a child no, and that's exactly what they want. Tell an adult don't cross this line, and they will cross that line. Why? It's our sin nature that's within us. Well, unfortunately, Eve chose to disobey, and God very clearly stated the consequences of it when he said in Genesis 2 and verse 17, of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. There's no doubt about the clarification or the clarity rather of the command. And here's the consequence: if you disobey, in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Satan tempted Eve to defy God's commands, and ultimately she perceived that it would be better for her to disobey God and do what she wanted to do, and so she ate of the forbidden fruit. The Bible then teaches that she gave it to Adam, and Adam also did eat. And the moment that Adam ate of the forbidden fruit, sin and its consequence of death then entered into the world. Well, Adam did not immediately die, but this death entered the world in two ways. The immediate and most important way was that of the spiritual death. As soon as Adam and Eve ate of this fruit, they realized suddenly that they were naked, and they attempted to make a covering for themselves. The relationship with God was immediately severed by sin. But they furthermore began the process of dying, although it would be a considerable time before they actually died. Death entered the world by means of one man's sin. Romans 5, verse 12, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Because of sin, you and I are going to experience the reality of death. In John chapter number 11, John is ultimately writing with one goal in mind. John 20, verses 30 and 31 says what John's purpose in writing this gospel was. Many other signs did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name. To accomplish his goal, we might say, John chose 7 particular signs from the life of Jesus. This particular one in John 11 is the last of those 7 signs, and arguably is perhaps one of the most dramatic of them. It's in this particular scene that we once again illustrate both his deity and his humanity. We are allowed a glimpse into his humanity that deeply grieves the loss of a friend. I know as a child we would go around oftentimes, what's the shortest verse of the Bible? I know, Jesus wept, ha 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 ha. Okay? I wish my professors gave me that for a memory verse quiz. Okay? Sadly, some of my students in high school would have still failed it. But regardless, it would have been a very simple one to write word for word. But what I want you to see is the incredible ramifications of that very statement. You get a glimpse into his humanity, but we also find the glimpse into his deity, for no other one could have brought a man from the grave who had been dead for 4 days. But you also see as we go through this that Jesus never once tried to accomplish his ministry on his own timetable, but rather he was always dependent upon doing it in God's timetable. He never rushed it, and he never delayed it. This particular account, as Jesus will demonstrate his power over death, is a remarkable account because it provides us with great encouragement as we face both the challenge of sin and its consequence of death. Here's the reality for us as a child of God, and though we'll introduce this and it will become more of a focus in the next message, because he has the authority over death, those who know him do not need to fear it. And it is an amazing truth that is developed here in John chapter 11. The way that John develops this is by an account, a man by the name of Lazarus. This is not the same Lazarus who is in the Luke chapter 16, where he was laid at a gate and full of sores and begged food from the rich man's table. These are 2 different Lazarus. This one is the brother of both Mary and Martha. Well, let's begin by looking, first of all, at the illness of Lazarus in verses 1 through 3. Now a certain man was sick, named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore his sister sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. For the first time in the Gospel of John, the entire family of Lazarus and Mary and Martha are actually mentioned together. Each of them are mentioned separately, but never in the Gospel of John are they ever mentioned together until this point. The town of Bethany, as we find a little bit later on in verse 18, was about 15 furlongs southeast of Jerusalem. A furlong would be about 600 feet. I think the exact measurement is 607 feet. But if you were to just calculate it on 600 feet, the distance is about 1 3/4 miles southeast from Jerusalem. And that is where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were living. It may be that those to whom John is writing, of course, John's gospel is one of the last one. It would be the last one would be written and would be written considerable time after Jesus' death. And it may be that some of them weren't exactly familiar with who Lazarus and Martha were. And so he goes to very great lengths to properly introduce them, but Mary, who is a very common name, deserves a special mention. And this is how he describes her in verse 2. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment, wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. There were lots of Marys in the Word of God. We know of 3 just in the gospel narratives. John wanted to be sure that his readers knew exactly which Mary he was speaking of. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, causing a great indignation on those who witnessed the event. This was to them an elaborate gift of waste. But Jesus said this very act would be told for a memorial of her. This is how she would be known. And that is exactly years later how John describes her. The one who anointed the feet, or wiped his feet with her hair and anointed Jesus. There are lots of people today who view serving God as nothing more than a waste of life. Unfortunately, there are many Christians who seem to view serving God as a waste of life. They would instead think of life in terms of their job, their career, their possessions, their money, and the false sense of security that they believe that's going to provide. A life that is spent serving the Lord is never a life that is wasted. Any time that you deviate from serving the Lord, however, will ultimately be a life that is wasted, regardless of how much you may earn and what you may possess. Knowing the friendship that existed between Jesus and the family, his sisters sent word to Jesus in verse 3. They sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. They did not personally take the message to Jesus. Instead, they sent a messenger, and they remained behind with their brother. Where was Jesus? If you were to go back at the end of John chapter number 10, you would find that the Jews picked up stones and were about to stone him because he claimed to be God. And so Jesus left that area, Jerusalem and Judea, and he went to what is often described as Transjordan. This would be the area that would be to the east of the Jordan, and it would be about a day's journey from Bethany. By the time the messenger actually arrived, when we begin to put the various pieces of this account together, we would learn that Lazarus had actually already died, something that would have been unknown to the messenger. I know it may be difficult to believe, but they actually lived in a day when cell phones did not exist. Okay, texting before that was ever even a thing. Some of you didn't know there was such a time that existed before, without cell phones or even without texting. It's kind of an amazing thing. But anyway, here would be a messenger who began his journey. And Jesus ends up, as we put the various accounts or the various pieces of this account together, Jesus remains in that area for 2 days. And then he makes on the now 4th day the journey back to Bethany. That's why Lazarus will have already been dead for 4 days. The sickness, or the illness rather, of Lazarus. Number 2, the response of Jesus. Sometimes we marvel at how God does things, the way that he responds to situations that come up in our lives. His response here, I find it to be quite amazing and quite challenging, and that's where I want to spend our focus this morning. The first thing that he does is he explains the purpose of the illness. He says in verse 4, when Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. This sickness of Lazarus would not ultimately end in death. Would he still die? Yes, But it's not going to ultimately end there. The sickness was intended as being for the glory of God, as John says it, or as Jesus actually states it in verse 4, in order that Jesus, as the Son of God, would ultimately be glorified, that he would ultimately be exalted. Now, one of the things I think we need to understand is this, and it's a popular yet wrong idea that teaches that any type of illness or calamity is a punishment by God for sin. Understand, illness is not always a punishment by God for sin. It's possible that it is, but it is also possible that it is not. We run around oftentimes with a very critical attitude, and as the disciples who saw a man who was born blind and said, "Master, who did sin, this man or his parents?" Well, somebody must have done something wrong. This was the exact same reasoning that was behind Job's friends, who said, "Job, any kind of calamity to this degree must be the result of sin." And they refused to listen to whatever Job's defenses were, and they went round and round and round, each of his three friends providing three different addresses, Job responding to each one of them, saying, in essence, "Job, you need to confess your sin and get right with God." Sometimes God allows things into our lives for no other reason than for God to be glorified. Jesus, in this particular case, and we're just a few weeks really before his crucifixion, would be exalted and would be shown to be the very Son of God in a very amazing fashion. But I also want to point something out before we move on. That if God's purpose is that he be glorified, it would stand to reason that our response must be vital. If God wants to be glorified, we have to respond in a manner that glorifies him. His purpose in sending this trial, or whatever it might be, if it is that he is to be glorified, if we don't respond properly, his purpose comes to naught. Why did God allow whatever he's allowed? I don't always have the reasons for that. It may be for sin. It may be so that God can be glorified. If the reason is for God to be glorified, then it stands to reason that I have to respond in a way that will bring glory to him. If I do not, the purpose in his sending it will come to naught. The second way that he responds is perhaps one of the more puzzling ways. Number two, he delays the answer to their request. The Bible says in verse 5, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. When he had heard, therefore, that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was." All throughout this passage, we get glimpses into his humanity. John paints various portraits that allow us to further understand his nature as both God and man. And when we ponder these truths, they not only set the backdrop for the story, but also provide us with a lot of encouraging thoughts. And one of those is contained, I think, in verse 5. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Doesn't mean that he didn't love others. Doesn't mean that he didn't love the world, but it points us to a very special bond that existed between Jesus and these three individuals. Why did Jesus have to say that, or why did John insert that between this? I believe it's because of this. If you were Mary and Martha and Lazarus at the time, this delay would appear to be very insensitive. Jesus reminds us that this delay is not because of indifference. It's not that he didn't care, though his actions would perhaps suggest that he didn't care. If you were to get news today that a loved one was about to die, and you waited 2 or 3 days before you went to see them, you would be justly criticized by your family. It would appear to be extremely indifferent. We know how the story ends. We have the benefit of knowing that. But when you put yourself in the shoes of Mary and Martha and even the disciples, Lord, really? Don't you think we should go see him? Maybe we should schedule a visit. Maybe we should send someone else to go visit. To sit there and wait for 2 days would suggest that he was indifferent. Let me point out that when God's timing and God's actions do not line up with how we think they should be resolved, often one of the first things that we question is God's love. It is very easy for us to wrongly interpret God's silence or God's delays as being a lack of concern or a lack of compassion. But that's not the case. Paul made it clear in Romans 8:35 through 39 that there is absolutely nothing and nobody capable of separating us from the love of God. Nothing. There's no circumstance that you will ever encounter that is going to in some way cause God's love to be separated from you. God has always loved you, and God's always going to love you. So when these things enter into your life, rest assured that God's delays are not motivated by indifference. His delay was instead to do God's will in God's timetable. As soon as Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he remained where he was, the Bible says, for 2 days. Verse number 6. Throughout his entire lifetime, Jesus always functioned on God's divine timetable. Never once did he rush God's plan. Never once did he delay God's plan. His focus was always on doing the will of God. As such, I think it sets a tremendous example for us to follow when it comes to the matter of doing God's will. If we were to be honest, however, most of us would acknowledge that some of the most difficult aspects of the Christian life are accepting God's delays and waiting patiently on Him to answer our requests. It's very difficult. But it's absolutely vital that we understand accomplishing God's will encompasses doing the right thing in the right time. We emphasize doing the right thing often, but it is equally, if not more, that we are also to do it in the right time. And a very significant portion of God's will pertains to His timetable. And if you're honest with yourself, we oftentimes struggle to comprehend God's timetable. Why? They often exceed our comprehension and our understanding. But you are never asked to understand what God is doing. God never says you need to be able to figure this out. All God says is you need to trust me. So the delays may exceed and probably often exceed our comprehension. They often exceed our understanding, but our responsibility is to just simply trust Him and wait for Him, and do so patiently. Waiting is not something we necessarily have a choice over. How you wait is where you have the choice. Okay? The doctor says, well, you can't get in until January the 5th, well, guess what? You don't have a choice but to wait. Traffic stops. You don't have a choice but to wait. How you wait, however, you have a very great decision in and a huge choice to be able to make. I also want you to understand that Jesus did not allow himself to be dictated by what is commonly referred to as the tyranny of the urgent. Most of us would have immediately dropped everything we were doing because this would be an emergency that demanded immediate attention. I've got to be there. And I understand the seriousness of the situation, but I want us to understand oftentimes we find ourselves sidetracked from accomplishing God's will because of the needs and the demands of others. You and I, as believers, are oftentimes very easily distracted. You might be trying to focus on something, and a fly enters the room. Okay? It's amazing how distracting that can be. When I went down to move my parents, we had left the doors open to the house virtually all day, and there were a couple of flies that got in, and I went and laid down that night, and I needed to do some reading, and so I'm sitting there reading, and the house is just really, really quiet, and there's one fly. Just, and the sound, it might as well have been a jet flying through there. It was so loud. I got up, I swatted at that fly. I only had a shirt to swat at it with, and I'm swatting. I never did kill the fly. I'd open up the door and try to let him out, and eventually he went out, and I shut the door thinking, okay, now I can finally, and it wasn't but 15 minutes later, and that dumb fly was back in the room. I don't know if he went underneath the door. I don't know how he got in. I had fits with this fly. Why? Here I am trying to be focused, and I'm finding myself, oh, wow, there's a fly. Do you know how much we do that in the Christian life? God has us accomplishing a certain agenda, and here comes something else, and okay, well, let me just go over there. Before long, we're not doing what God has asked us to do because we have found ourselves dictating our life by whatever seems to be the most urgent. May not necessarily be, however, God's will for you to accomplish. You've got to be very discerning when it comes to this. The question then comes because the disciples end up greatly confused, as you can imagine, over Jesus' response. And for the remainder of the text that we'll look at today, we'll see this confusion. And there are some things that I think we have to avoid. And honestly, if we look at our lives, there are times when God simply does not make sense. What He's doing, when He's doing it, and why He's doing it often is a great puzzle to us. We have our ideas. Seldom does God ever go with my ideas. Okay? I think my ideas are grand. I've even told God that. And God seems to, I think, shake His head and say, no, your idea is bad. My idea is much better. How do we respond when God does not make sense? Number one, trust God's directives. He waits for 2 days. Then He says to His disciples, verse 7, let us go into Judea again. His disciples say unto Him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone Thee. Goest Thou thither again? Jesus, I know You're God, but I need to tell you something. The Jews most recently attempted to stone You there. Do you really think this is a good idea? His directive seemed to deny common sense and safety. I am not saying go jump off a cliff or go jump off the building and trust that God's going to take care of you. There is a degree of common sense that God expects us to use. It's okay to buckle your seatbelt in a car. Okay? In fact, if you don't, you're liable to get a ticket, okay? And so these things are fine. But His directive, which is very clear, according to verse 6, or 7 rather, There's no doubt about what it was that he wanted to do, but the reality was the disciples saw this and said, man, Jesus, this may not necessarily be all that good of an idea. I personally think that they were equally concerned about their own safety. Jesus didn't say, I'm going there. He said, let us go there. How would you feel? Jesus, if you want to go there, go ahead. I'm going to stay here. Okay? We're in this thing. Yeah, I'm not sure about this, and I know their statement makes it sound as though the focus is, protect the Lord, but I'm not sure that they didn't have a little bit of a selfish agenda behind this as well. And so Jesus responds to them by using an illustration to teach a spiritual truth. The Jews, to understand this, divided the day into two 12-hour segments. So he says in verse number 9, Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? You say, no, there's 24. No, they're dividing it into two segments. The daylight would be represented by a 12-hour segment, and night would be represented by a second 12-hour segment. If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of this world. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbleth, because there's no light in him. When you walk in the daytime, you see objects that you can avoid. It's much safer to walk in the daytime. When you get up in the middle of the night to use the restroom or whatever the case may be, it is much safer to have some sort of a light. Isn't it amazing how things end up out in the middle of the floor after you went to bed and nobody's been up? Okay? What happened? How did that get out there? I don't know, okay? You walk through a house, and it's smart to turn on a light somewhere. Why? Because you will see objects that otherwise you may not see. And this is the principle that he's teaching. The person, in contrast, who walks at night is unable to see the danger and therefore stumbles. What is Jesus saying? When Jesus says he's walking in the light, he was busy and determined to do his Father's will. John 9, he uses a similar analogy, verses 4 and 5. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of this world. Now we might say, knowing Jesus' life, that this was just about the 11th hour of his day. He was very close to the end of his life. Jesus knew that nothing would happen to him prematurely when he was going about doing the Father's will. The same thing is able to be said of us today. When you are doing God's will, and you are right in the center of it, it is a place of great security because nothing's going to happen to you prematurely. You're doing God's will, and you're right in the center of it. No, I do not personally think that the disciples still comprehended everything that's going on. And so that leads us to our second point. How do we respond when God does not make sense? Number 2, avoid arrogantly thinking you know what is best. This is an intriguing one to me. He says in verse number 11, these things said he, and after that he saith unto them, our friend Lazarus sleepeth. But I go that I may awake him out of sleep. Then said his disciples, Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well. Howbeit Jesus spake of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking of rest in sleep. Then Jesus said unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent ye may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. I kind of chuckle a little bit at this. He says, our friend is sleeping, and I'm going to go wake him up. Lazarus clearly is not just a friend to Jesus, but also to the disciples, and the disciples did not understand the implications of what Jesus was saying. To them, Jesus, or Lazarus rather, was taking a nap. He was sleeping. And so they reasoned, well, Lord, if he's sleeping, he shall do well. This is a good thing, Lord. You, therefore, should really let him sleep. When it comes to the matter of God's directives, oftentimes we feel we have a better understanding. Our mind reasons along two things: what we can observe and what we believe to be true. Keep in mind, it may not be true. But our minds reason along the path of what we're able to observe and what we believe to be true. God, however, is omniscient and knows everything. And so here the disciples are arguing with Jesus, who is God, and they say, number one, maybe you really shouldn't go there. It's not going to be too safe. Well, Lord, maybe you should just let him sleep. Because that really is what would be good for him. Now, everybody in here, I think, knows Lazarus is dead, correct? Let's say this. Let's pretend for just a moment that Lazarus was not dead and that he truly was sleeping. If Jesus were going to wake him, would it have not been best for him to be awake? Am I right? If Jesus were going to wake him and say, well, no, it'd be better that he sleeps. No, if God's will was that he be awake, what's the best thing for Lazarus? Be awake. Oh, no, he needs to be sleeping. No. Stop thinking that you know what is best. Often we debate God's directives because we perceive we know what is best. As this story is going to reveal, God was about to work in ways that nobody would ever have dreamed. Paul thought it would be best that the thorn in the flesh would be taken from him. God said, my grace is sufficient for you. I think that it would be best for me to have a life free of adversity and great blessing and so forth. God says, no. I think it would be best to have a nice, big, fat checking account. After all, I could tithe out of it, benefit God's work. God says, once again, no. I have my ideas and God has his. You have your ideas and once again, God has his. How many times do they actually work out the same way? Often they don't. But isn't it awfully arrogant to think that we know best? And Jesus, to tell them, look, guys, you don't understand this. Lazarus is dead. I wonder if their jaws kind of hit the floor. How he knew that, we're not told. Maybe his omniscience, my guess. But anyway, verse 15, I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there. Well, that's pretty insensitive. Lazarus died, and I'm glad I wasn't there. You know, if you go through the Gospels, nobody ever died in the presence of Jesus. Interesting. He's the Prince of Life. No one ever died throughout his earthly ministry. And the miracle that they were about to witness, I'm glad I wasn't there. Why? So that ye may believe. There's something in this for you guys. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. In order for us to be able to see it, we're going to have to go. Then said Thomas, which is called Didymus, meaning twin, unto his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Now, Thomas is still focused on the danger of returning to Jerusalem and the surrounding area, and I might say with good reason. To him, the return spelled certain death. We could criticize Thomas for his negativity. I would instead actually, even though I'm typically more negative, praise him for his commitment. Now you want to look at this. Thomas sees going back to Jerusalem as Jesus is going to die. So let's also go and we'll die with him. Is that being Eeyore? Okay. No, I would say it's instead expressing quite a bit of commitment to Him so that we can also die. I trust God's directives when God doesn't make sense. I avoid arrogantly thinking that I know what is best when God doesn't make sense. And thirdly, I trust God's timing. Verse number 17, when Jesus came, He found that He had lain in the grave 4 days already. He died the day that the messenger went to Jesus. That's day number 1. He stayed behind for 2 days. He made a day's journey back to Bethany. That's day number 4. The Jews did not embalm a body. They anointed it with oils and spices, and they put it in the tomb that very day. He's been dead for 4 days. Keep in mind, a Jew would look at a portion of a day as being a day. So he died at some point while the messenger was on his way, and he's been dead now for 4 days. And Jesus got there and he discovered this like, oh wow, I didn't even have a clue that this happened. Obviously he knew it happened because he told his disciples, Lazarus is dead. So Jesus makes his journey. Verse 18, Bethany was nigh unto Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs off. I already told you, just under 2 miles. And many of the Jews came to Martha and to Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Very reasonable to think, given the proximity to Jerusalem. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Mary sat still in the house. Kind of interesting. You always see that. Martha's always going. Martha's sitting. There's a lot that's able to be, I think, seen from that. But anyway, you still see their character there. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. But I know that even now whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. Now, it is very difficult to determine whether or not Martha's statement is intended as a statement of faith or if it's a spirit of criticism. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Or, Lord, I know if you had been here, he would not have died. Now, let me point out to you, regardless of what her statement's intent was, she was a little bit flawed in her logic. Did Jesus have to be physically present for her brother to live? No. The centurion said, Jesus, you can heal my son from a distance. You don't have to be physically present. Now, it is accurate in the sense that if he had been present, he wouldn't have died. Nobody did die in his presence. And then Mary says the exact same thing a little bit later on. Verse 32, we're just going to skip some verses. When Mary was come where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. Now, to me, as I read this, both Martha and Mary were struggling with comprehending God's timing. I don't understand this, Lord. If you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. But I know that whatever thou asks of God, that he will give it to you. I see it an inward struggle, a difficulty comprehending what it was that God was doing. Let me point out to you that God's timing is always best. He may not work in the time that we feel he should. Sometimes it occurs sooner than we would have ever imagined. That doesn't happen as often, does it? Okay. Every now and then, God, wow, I didn't expect you to answer that prayer that quickly, Lord. Oftentimes, it seems delayed. Let me give you some verses that will just teach us this principle in closing. Let God be God. Let him do what he wills in his time. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. Amen. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Man, Lord, I don't like waiting, huh? Let God be God. Number 2, or second verse, Psalm 37, verse 7, rest in the Lord and wait impatiently for him. Had to see if some of you are awake. Wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way. The context is the evil person who just seems to have it made. Why do they get all the nice cars in the bank account, blah, blah, blah. That was David's struggle. Psalm 73, you could look at that as well. Isaiah 40, verse 31, I don't have the reference type there. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Let God be God. It's always going to be best. So, are you faced with something when God just right now doesn't make sense? Trust His directives. What do you know to do? Then do it. Avoid arrogantly thinking you know what's best. Well, I think, Lord, that if I had this job, or if I had this thorn in the flesh removed, or if I had this taken care of, that, I think that would be best. Not in an improper sense, but God didn't ask you what you think is best. Okay? And number 3, trust God's timing. Let God be God. And you might find Him to be quite amazing. As a musician comes, I want to ask the most important question, and that's this.